All right. Well, I'm going to start. It is my great honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Joshua Coleman. He is a psychologist in private practice in the San Francisco Bay Area and co-chair of the Council on Contemporary Families. He has lectured at Harvard University and at the University of California at Berkeley. He blogs and holds webinars for estranged parents. He has been a frequent guest on the Today Show, NPR, and the BBC, and has been featured in many television shows and publications, all the way from Sesame Street to AARP, in an article written by Meredith Marin, an ISNAF salon guest. Also, in other shows, including 2020, Good Morning America, PBS, numerous news programs, Fox, ABC, CNN, and NBC. His advice appears often in the New York Times, the Times of London, the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, Newsweek, the Chicago Tribune, Slate, Psychology Today, Parenting Magazine. He is also the author of numerous articles and chapters and has written 4 books, including one he brought tonight, When Parents Hurt, Compassionate Strategies When You and Your Grown Child Don't Get Along. His books have been translated into Chinese, Croatian, and Korean. I'm very eager to hear his talk this evening. The topic of his presentation is the 5 most common mistakes of estranged parents and how to repair them. I give you Dr. Joshua Coleman.
Well, thank you, and it's good to be up here. I know when I'm in the audience at this time of the day, I'm really about ready to fall asleep, so hopefully you'll be able to stay awake at least for 2 more hours. I'd like to start just by thanking the board, Karen LeBeau for founding ISNAF, George Ross, who gave me a ride last night at 10 o'clock at night on a Friday night, which probably is what most of us want to be doing on a Friday night at 10 o'clock, which was very, very kind of him. Michael Konzachi, am I pronouncing your name right, Mike? Pardon? Konzaki, okay, sorry, who I saddled with a massive copying job. I sent him some handouts, which are all back there, so even if you don't read them, you should at least take them, so I don't feel guilty about giving him this massive copying job. And then also Karen Schwenkmeyer, Ling Huang, and Kelly, the wonderful staff of ISNAF. So I'd like to start by saying that I come at this topic from both a personal and professional perspective. Like so many of the other speakers today, I also was estranged from my daughter, who's now 32. We are reunited, but there was a period of time in her early 20s, around 22 to 25, 26, where we had either no contact or the contact that we had was very distant, angry, and it was certainly the most painful, difficult, disorienting thing that I ever have had to go through or would ever want to go through again. And at the time, there was very little written to help me kind of find my way through. So when we did reconcile, I really used a lot of the kind of techniques and perspectives that I learned through that experience to write my book, When Parents Hurt. Since I wrote that book, it came out in 2007, I probably corresponded with thousands of estranged parents in the United States and actually around the world, and counseled hundreds of parents and estranged adult children in my practice as well. So this work has shown me that parental estrangement can come from a lot of different places. So my talk tonight will not just be on parental alienation syndrome. I'll be talking about estrangement from kind of a broad brushstroke. From my perspective, there are many ways that a parent and child can become estranged from each other. One common one, particularly with a parent and adult child, is that the parent refuses to acknowledge or repair the ways that they might have been hurtful to the child when they were younger, or they continue to engage in hurtful or problematic behavior now that the child is an adult. Now, that one is what, when people think about estrangement, they think that's typically what happened. Most people don't know when somebody says, I'm estranged from my child. Most people don't realize that you can be estranged from your child. I mean, everybody who's a victim of PAS knows that. But there's a lot of other ways you can be estranged from a child that does not have to do with the fact that you were a bad parent, that you were abusive or disinterested or neglectful. But when people think about, in kind of the common culture, somebody says, oh, I'm estranged from my child, people sort of assume that you must have done something really bad. And so there's this kind of shame about it that parents have. I call estrangement the silent epidemic in the United States. And it's a silent epidemic because people feel so ashamed about it. Who wants to admit it? I mean, I'm a freaking psychologist, for God's sake. You know, it was very hard for me to say, people would say, oh, how's your daughter? Oh, I don't know. I haven't talked to her in about 2 years. You know, and I would sort of wait for the look if I was going to get the look that says, well, you must have done something. A very common way that parents can get estranged from an adult child is when they marry. That in the same powerful way that a parental alienation syndrome can happen, where the parent very intentionally tries to malign the parent with the child, the same thing can happen when somebody gets married, or the person that they marry does that, particularly if they marry somebody who has a personality disorder, who's borderline or narcissistic, or they may just be somebody who's just much more powerful than your kid. And it's kind of a remarkably easy thing to do. I mean, a lot of people come from homes where the parents did a really good job, where the kids themselves would say that my parent, yes? Okay, sure. Is that better? Yes. Okay. I wonder about why people were kind of straining, giving the look. So the daughter-in-law or son-in-law can be a very, very powerful source of estrangement and a very common source of estrangement. We've talked a lot today about divorce as a factor, so I'm not going to talk a lot about that in terms of analyzing it, because others have done it very well already today. Another common source of estrangement is where the new partner of the husband or wife doesn't like his or her stepchildren, or the stepchildren don't like him or her, or none of them like the other. That can also be a common reason how parents and their children can become estranged and distant. An interestingly common one is where the adult child was very close to the parents growing up. In some ways, one might argue, too close. Maybe it was a child who wasn't very assertive psychologically, a good kid, a sweet kid. And the only way that they know how to become separate from their parents, now that they're adults, is to actually reject the parent. The only way that they can feel separate from the parent is to reject the parent. But before I get into any really specific recommendations, and I promise you I will do that, I'd like to take a view from 10,000 feet up and examine why so many parents are going through this these days. One of the most radical changes in the past century, and in particular in the past 4 or 5 decades, is what we expect from our children. If you look at parenting surveys in the 1920s, what parents wanted from their children was for them to respect them, if not to fear them, and they wanted them to basically be conforming, church-going, synagogue-going, upstanding members of society. Parents also viewed their children prior to the 20th century in particular as being kind of robust, that the idea that competition, stress, the rigors of life would actually make them stronger, that those weren't things to shelter children from, but were rather things to expose the children to make them more competent people. In colonial times, it wasn't uncommon for parents to show children a dead relative so they could be exposed to what death looks like, and they could kind of make peace about that. Starting in the 1960s and steadily increasing after, parents started caring much more about their children developing their own voices, about being assertive, about raising their children's self-esteem, and helping their children know what they wanted and who they were, and being assertive enough to go after that and get it. Imbuing them with the feeling that they could be anything that they want to be and become whatever they wanted to become. It's sort of the myth of the meritocracy on steroids. People also started spending much more time with their parents in the past 4 decades. In the past 4 decades, fathers have tripled the amount of time that they spend with their children, and moms have doubled the amount of time they spend with their children. A working career mom today spends more time with her children than a stay-at-home mom did in the 1960s. And the way that she does that is she gives up time for herself, for her friends, for her social activities, and sleep. But there's been this huge source of anxiety that parents have now about their children. Are they going to get through the narrow bottleneck of opportunities? Are they going to get into college? Are they going to have a job when they get out of college? Are they going to become drug addicts? Are they going to have low self-esteem? Are they going to have ADD? There's so much that parents are dosed with every single day that makes today's parents very, very anxious and very, very guilt-ridden. So while parents of earlier generations wanted their children to respect, if not fear them, what do today's parents want from their children? Anybody care to guess? Exactly. They want them to like them. They want them to love them. And they don't necessarily assume that they're going to be liked or loved. Parents stopped assuming that love from their children was something that they were entitled to or could expect to count on as the years went on. And as this room full of people show, all of us have experienced, there's some wisdom in no longer having that expectation. So parents find themselves in the position where we've basically gone from it being the child's job to earn the parent's love to it now being the parent's job to earn the child's love. And the court system, as it's currently structured, plays into that path. It's what Brian was so eloquently talking about how a child even has their own attorney now. So, for example, right now I'm working with a case, a family, a psychologist in private practice, and it's a 14-year-old, and pretty much in California, once you get to be 13 or 14 and you're divorced, their parents are divorced, if you don't want to live with your mom or your dad, you don't want to visit them, the courts say, well, we're not going to enforce it. It's up to the kid. So let's get this straight, okay? Kids can't vote. They can't drive a car. They can't own a gun, but they can make the most important decision they will ever make in their life, and that's about which parent they can spend with. That to me is so maddening. Every time I work with one of these cases, I have to really control my anger and just, so I don't look like I'm more personally involved than I am, which of course I am. But it's what makes me good at what I do because I really understand what these parents are feeling. Finally, over the course of the 20th century and continuing well into the present, we view children as being fragile and vulnerable, and that competition and the stresses of life are going to weaken them, and that we think that what children need is what one author referred to as a kind of hothouse parenting, where every little emotion has to be really carefully tended to, and every little trait or attribute or positive quality has to be radically developed and attended to. So this puts an enormous amount of pressure on parents, and it really intensifies the household where children are being raised. So what's been the impact of this change in parenting? Well, in many ways, the self-esteem of young adults today is through the roof. They've all got really, really high self-esteem. In the 1950s, only 12% of teenagers agreed with the statement, "I am an important person." By the late 1980s, 80% of teenagers agreed with that statement. A significantly higher percentage of today's young adults believe that they're going to be famous, a finding far less common with prior generations. Why is that the case? Because we've all been telling them that they can be anybody that they want to be and be whoever they want to be if they only try hard enough. One of the effects of our spending so much time and money helping our children feel like they can be anything they want to be and do anything that they want is that they come into adulthood with a very high degree of confidence on one hand and a huge amount of entitlement on the other. But there's a very big difference between high self-esteem and happiness, or high self-esteem and success. And this has been researched. There's a psychologist, Baumeister, B-A-U-M-E-I-S-T-E-R, where he was initially one of the big self-esteem proponents, and he found that there's basically no correlation between the two. You can have very, very high self-esteem, and it's not going to necessarily make you more successful. At least it's not a causal agent. It may be associated with success, but having high self-esteem in and of itself does not make you more successful. I have a little Marco Rubio moment here. At least it wasn't over here, So we produce these kids with very high self-esteem, but yet mental illness is actually on the rise. Particularly in the past few decades. Today, the lifetime rate of major depression is 10 times higher than it was in 1915. This is despite 2 world wars that those young adults went through. The number of people being treated for depression more than tripled in the 10-year period between 1987 and 1997. Depression also arrives at younger and younger ages. The number of kids on mood-altering drugs tripled between 1966 and 1987. Today's young adults are also children, and younger generations are also more worried. Twice as many people reported symptoms of panic attacks in 96 compared to 1980, and 40% more people said that they felt like they were in the middle of an impending nervous breakdown in 1996 than in 1957. So these changes in mental illness are so dramatic, and this is a really interesting finding, that it's led some scholars to observe that the era that children grow up in is in many ways more important than any particular family of origin. So the era, what's going on in the culture, what the economics are, how the culture of parenting has changed, how anxious the parents are. These things have a huge impact on the children and their identity. Many of today's young adults are seekers, traveling around the country, if not the world, in search for meaning and self-discovery. There was a study done by Continental Airlines and found that 20-somethings will typically visit 9 different countries before they're 25, and most first traveled to a foreign destination when they were 8 years old. So it just highlights how much privilege most of our children have been raised in. I mean, those children, if you're at least middle class or above. But these are children who've been given everything, and yet they're not happier. And it makes them very confused about what they're entitled to, particularly in regards to the relationship with their parents. Even religion has changed from being about service and worship to, as one writer humorously put it, a view of God as a divine butler and cosmic therapist on call 24/7, helping them feel better about themselves, but demanding little in return. Now, to kind of get to the heart of my talk, one of the central causes of estrangement, from my perspective, is driven by the American culture of self-determination. Now, other cultures have cultures of determination, self-determination as well, as I'll talk about shortly. But in the United States, probably more than any other country, we believe that striking out on your own, being independent, not needing anybody, doing it yourself, is something to always be admired rather than questioned. That ties to one's parents should be voluntary rather than necessary. Where becoming independent of your parents is considered the ultimate mark of adulthood, especially now that other markers of adulthood are harder to achieve. So, for example, today's young adults, you may know this, take far longer to reach adulthood compared to and economic and emotional maturity than their contemporaries 5 or 6 decades ago. This is based on research by Frank Furstenberg at University of Pennsylvania. By age 30, only half as many young adults had achieved all the traditional markers of adulthood that they had in 1960, particularly marriage and parenthood. So what's important about this is that the usual markers of adulthood have been replaced by more personal psychological assessments of maturity, such as confidence or self-esteem, or the belief that one doesn't need one's family. One of the ways that some young adults feel like they've reached adulthood is to reject their parents, is to say that I can tell that I'm an adult now because I'm on my own. Or they'll say that they don't want to be close to their parents because they're worried that they're going to be too influenced by them. So they have to reject their parents in order to feel separate from them. There's a sociologist named Amy Shallot who wrote a wonderful book called Not Under Our Roofs. And has anybody read that, by the way? It poses the question, it's a comparison of Dutch parents and American parents. And it poses the question, would you let your 16-year-old, teenager or above, have his or her girlfriend or boyfriend spend the night? Now, how many in here would say yes? Okay, so one person would. You'd fit in well in Holland. Most Americans would not. Yet in Holland, that's actually very, 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 very common. And she kind of uses that question as a way to compare what she describes as two different types of individualism. One is what she calls interpersonal individualism, the idea that children are raised in the home where the parents can really closely monitor such things as their sexuality and their alcohol use. Dutch parents also let their children, by a certain age, drink alcohol with the family. And another thing that very few American parents would do. So she calls that interpersonal individualism, meaning that the same goal, the goal is similar to the goal of parents in the United States to produce a fully functioning, independent person, but it's different from what she described American parents as being adversarial individualism. The idea that you become an individual in opposition to your parents, that you do so by kind of fighting your way out of it. That from that perspective, and we as Americans sort of assume that a rebellious teenager is just normal adolescence, but what we don't know is rebellious teenagers don't exist in all societies. It's partly what we do as parents and partly what we expect to happen. So we normalize things that other cultures wouldn't necessarily believe. And I think that we do have it worse here. There was a study out of USC recently that compared 5 Western industrialized nations. It was the US, the UK, Germany, Spain, and Israel. And what they found was that only about half of parents in the United States report affectionate relationships with their adult children. Parents in the US report twice as much arguing and criticism and experience lower levels of attachment to their adult children than parents in the other countries studied. As a mother in my practice said to me recently, in India, we don't have all this mother hatred that you have in the United States. Again, there's something about our society, and something that I hopefully have just named for you, that really increases these kinds of problems. So, how am I doing time-wise? Anybody know? 30 minutes, wow. Something about being up here, it's kind of like, it's like you enter a different zone, and something that you thought would take 15 minutes takes twice as long. All right, well, so I'm going to fast forward then to the actual, I didn't have much more to say. It wasn't very interesting. You're not missing anything. It's actually kind of boring, really, but, I had to fill up the time with something. So let's get into the 5 mistakes of estranged parents. And I almost hate to use the word mistake because we're all so guilt-ridden. If we're going through an estrangement or we've been through one, we all have so much guilt that I almost hate to use it. But what I want to highlight is that once an estrangement begins, and it may begin very benignly, so if you have an adult child, it may begin by your adult child saying they don't want to see you as much, or come over so often, or I don't like how you're talking to my spouse, or I don't like how you're, talking about, I don't like how you are as a grandparent. It may start out with something that if it were addressed in a certain way might not be problematic. But however it starts, whether it's through parental alienation syndrome or some of these other kind of more benign ways that I'm talking about, it's really like quicksand. And that is that the more you fight to get out of it, the more you're going to get sucked down into it. Why? Because there's nothing so terrifying, heartrending, heartbreaking, enraging than having your own child turn against you. And it's even doubly angering and frustrating and provocative if you feel like there's somebody else behind the wheels kind of pulling on them to behave in a certain way. So it doesn't bring out the best in us, does it? It doesn't really bring out responses from us that we necessarily are going to feel proud about or good about. Typically, it brings out our most primitive, scared, reactionary, and I don't mean that in the political sense, responses, because we're getting our whole survival turned on its head. So when I say mistakes, I want to let people know that these are inevitable mistakes. There's almost no way that you can't make these mistakes. So the issue isn't shaming yourself or being mad at yourself or criticizing yourself for making them. It's really just understanding what they are and developing a strategy around them. The first mistake I want to talk about is the assumption that a reconciliation with your child should be based on principles of fairness rather than practicality. So it has to be practicality, because the only thing that ties you to your particularly adult child, I mean, maybe if you've got a great lawyer like Brian, you know, you can maybe get the courts to work in your favor. But it has to be practicality, because the only thing that ties you these days to your child is whether or not that child wants to have a relationship with you. Gone are the days of honor thy mother and thy father. Gone are the days of you don't, spend time with me or have a relationship with me, you don't get the family farm. So what do parents have, right? You don't have a lot of power in these situations. That's why we need the courts to change. You can have the most evolved child psychologist in the world, as Brian said, but if you don't have the courts putting some teeth into it, it's not going to make a difference. So the biggest influence you have is getting the child to want to spend time with you. And if you're too oriented towards what's fair and feeling like it's unjust, you're probably not going to communicate in a way that's going to really work for you. So you have to think about what works, even if it feels really unfair. Because let's look at it this way. If it were really fair, the model would be the same. It would be with your spouse or a close friend. You hurt their feelings, they hurt your feelings, you talk about it, you make up, you part ways, next time you do it better. It's not going to go that way with your kid. A lot of adult children in particular say they want a relationship of equality with their parents, but in reality, it's actually not going to be a relationship of equality where you get to talk about your feelings in the same way that they do. It's not going to be a kumbaya moment of where your needs and feelings are represented the same way. So one of the reasons that so many of us make so many mistakes is that we haven't really encountered anything like this in our lives ever before. What prepares us for this, right? There are no parallels, right? I mean, if you have a parent that dies, you can empathize with somebody else whose parent has died. If you go through a divorce, you can get counsel from somebody else who's been through a divorce. But what prepares us for knowing how to manage these kinds of feelings? So again, the mistakes are understandable. But getting back to the fairness, if it were fair, you'd get to make demands about how much time you could spend with your children or your grandchildren. If it were fair, you could demand more empathy and more forgiveness for whatever ways you did make mistakes, and we all make them. Occasionally, I'll get a parent will say, I didn't really make any mistakes. And I'm like, oh, yes, you did. Because you can't be a parent and not make serious mistakes. We all do them. Parenting is a science of approximations. We can never get it completely right. And some kids are much harder to parent than others. So you could demand more commitment if it were fair, but that's not going to buy you anything either. If it were fair, you would get credit for all the money you spent on your child and all the time for being a more dedicated parent than maybe was your ex if there was a divorce, or maybe you're a much more dedicated parent than you were. So many parents I work with say, God, these kids are complaining about their childhood. I'll show them a tough childhood. I was beaten. I didn't get to do anything. I didn't get to go on any trips. I put my kid through private schools. I sacrificed for them. I gave them everything, and now they're going to cut me off? Where is the justice in that? And what's that? Oh, and the answer is there is no justice in that. And you can't look for a justice because it'll just make you feel too angry and too embittered. If it were fair, your child would understand that when you say you did the best that you could, you mean that you really did the best that you could. That we as parents are only in many ways as good as the parents that we were raised by our circumstances, by the marriage we find ourselves in, by our economics, by the psychological temperament that we have. I mean, parents typically do the best that they could. So if it was fair, you'd be able to get some credit for that. Finally, if it were fair, you'd be able to talk about all the ways that your child themselves might have made parenting difficult, in the way that our children bring their own issues into the world, or that we married partners who were really difficult for this. So this whole principle about fairness is really the wrong orientation. You have to think purely from the perspective of what's practical, what's going to actually get your child back in your life. So let's talk about some of that. What's required is that you still be a parent to your child of any age during the period of estrangement, but it's not, particularly with an adult child, it's not the same model you'd normally use. You actually have to have more of the model, even with an adult child, of what you would do with a 2 or a 3-year-old. And I don't mean that in any disrespectful way to the older or adult children. What I mean is that it requires a certain kind of selflessness from you. It requires you to have to give without really expecting a whole lot in return. You're going to have to reconcile yourself to the fact that it's pretty much of a one-way street. So in that sense, it doesn't exactly work to think of it as parenting a younger child, because at least a toddler will, crawl up in your lap. Your estranged child is probably not going to do that. It also requires patience, because nothing is more infuriating, humiliating, and devastating than the rejection from your own child. It requires patience because in all likelihood, once you find yourself in an estrangement, there aren't typically fast solutions. It's going to take time. For some of you in the room, you may have been dealing with one for years, and it may go on for more years. So you have to have kind of a psychological orientation and perspective that's going to allow you to take that marathon run. Finally, and this can be tricky terrain as well, is it's important to have unconditional love for your child. And I think it's a lot to ask, I know, when you feel so betrayed and mistreated and maligned and hurt. But it's not only going to orient you more toward having a better relationship with your child or maximizing the probability of a reconciliation. It's going to also feel better to you. In Buddhism, and I'm not a big practicer of Buddhism, but they have this meditation that I have found useful called the loving kindness meditation. You actually extend love to the person that you're feeling the most hurt by or mad at. And the idea is to try to inhabit those feelings of serenity and peace, because hating doesn't feel very good, and neither does feeling enraged. Of course, maybe it's too much to ask you to do that for your ex, so I won't make you do that. But that would be a good exercise. The more difficult it is, the better. So you also have to work towards a deep feeling of self-acceptance. I know it's a tall order, so how do you do that? Well, one is to be in ongoing dialogue with yourself about the ways that you either were or are still a good parent. If you read my book, When Parents Hurt, I have a list in there. It's called My Value as a Parent. And in this exercise, you write out, say, 10 things that makes you a good parent. Maybe 10 memories that you have of things that you did. I sacrificed for my kids. I spent money on them. I stayed in a marriage longer than I should have. I mean, whatever it is that you feel makes you feel like you were a good parent, write those out and read those when you're feeling really bad, because it's very hard not to buy into your child's rejection and feel like, well, if they think I'm not a good parent, then I guess I wasn't. And that's a very powerful thing. So the other part that's very important is to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. A lot of estranged parents isolate themselves because they feel so depressed and unloved. They engage in self-destructive activities. They don't do things that are good for them. They feel like they don't deserve to do things that are good for them. They feel like, if my own child doesn't love me, or doesn't want to be close to me, what do I deserve? What's the meaning of my life? And that's a really big mistake. You have to do things that are stimulating to you and valuable to you to remind you of your self-worth. And also, as Valerie had said, you want to be able to have a smile on your face when they want to see you. If you act like you feel too miserable, and particularly if you act like they're making you too miserable, they're not going to want to be nearly as close to you. So let's move on to mistake number 2. Now, mistake number 2 is huge, and it's both subtle and not so subtle. And that is trying to motivate your child through guilt or not being mindful about the ways that you communicate with your child that might make them feel guilty. The reality is that, especially with adult children today, guilt is your biggest enemy. It used to be in our society, and it still is in many other cultures, that a parent had a right to make a child feel guilty. There's jokes about it. I mean, I'm Jewish, so, there's big jokes about guilt-tripping Jewish mothers. I mean, my mother used to guilt-trip me sometimes, and I wouldn't call. What, you can't call your mother? So it's a big fancy doctor out there in California. Can't call your mother in Ohio? So, I mean, I don't feel like I can do that as successful. I certainly wouldn't do it with my daughter. I might do it with my twin sons, since I've never had an estrangement from them. But guilt in general is your enemy. And the reason that it's your enemy is that you can't really make those sorts of demands anymore. That it just makes your child feel bad. The only glue that you have, the only power that you have, is that your child feels good being with you, and that you don't make them feel bad about being with you. So, and it gets all wrapped up into this kind of independent individuation thing of like, well, I'm not going to be around anybody who makes me feel guilty because nobody has to tell me what to do. And you're just as likely to hear a 32-year-old say that today as you are a 16-year-old. So making your child feel guilty or like they owe you for all the things that they kind of do owe you for will not buy you anything, except it will make them not want to spend time with you. And that's a problem. There's a very strong sense in our culture that if a relationship, including a relationship with a parent, makes you feel bad, then you're somehow being a bigger person, more courageous, if you actually just cut that person off. I mean, it's something that just drives me crazy about our society right now, where you're sort of treated like you're a stronger person if you just say, well, that relationship, I mean, it's one thing to do that to a boyfriend or a girlfriend, but parents are basically given the same kind of power to be rejected. Well, I just cut them off. I just said I wasn't going to be talked to like that, and that can be treated by one's peers today as a source of self-esteem. What are some other examples of trying to motivate your child through guilt? One is to just talk about how unhappy you are with the estrangement. So it's just going to backfire on you. If you talk about how hurt you feel, how bereft, how sad, it's actually not going, I'm not going to say that they don't care, because they actually do care. But ironically, one of the things about our raising children in a much more intimate way is that they don't have a whole lot of immunity to us. So that when we say we feel hurt or sad or lonely or we miss them, they don't feel nearly as immune to it in the way that prior generations might have felt where there wasn't so much closeness and intimacy with parents. So there are plenty of things that can make your adult child feel guilty. The last I'll mention is criticizing them or their spouse in any way. That is just basically a big no-no. I've seen over and over again that the parent criticizes the spouse or the boyfriend or girlfriend, often, for kind of obvious reasons. Well, maybe you shouldn't marry that person since they just got out of prison, and, they have that kind of drug history thing, and, they have that massive debt. Maybe that wouldn't be the best person. Even something benign gets kind of tangled up in the child's feelings of individuation and kind of like, well, I will decide who I'm going to marry, and if I want to marry somebody who's, an ex-con, then damn it, that's who I'm going to marry. So you do have to tread kind of lightly. We now expect a kind of intensity or friendship and intimacy from our children over their life course. There's a greater expectation that we're going to be close to them because we have been, in many ways, better parents than were ours. We do know more about parenting. Most of us have read books. I mean, how many of your parents read a parenting book? I think my parents read one because my younger brother was ADD. But other than that, I mean, my parents' generations didn't read parenting books. I mean, I'm a fan, don't get me wrong. I mean, I've written a few, but it just shows, how careful we've all tried to be as parents. And so the good news of that is that it's created a lot of intensity. And when it goes well, it can go fabulously well. A kid can feel really close to their parents. But it can also make the parent feel much more betrayed and bitter and sad and bereft that this kid that they put so much love and energy and money and education into is now treating them like crap and like they're not worth anything and like they can just, turn away from them. So it's just that much more rejecting to us when it does happen. But children are much more aware of their parents' feelings because the parents are much more aware of the child's feelings. One of we have fewer children, we've parented them more closely, so often the children have a much clearer sense of who we are than maybe we had of our own parents. Now, this can be particularly true in single-parent households where there's not another parent there to deflect the child's needs. If they're really dependent, for example, on a single mom, when they grow up, they may have to reject her as a way to show or prove their independence or gain some kind of immunity to her feelings. I've worked with many single mothers where dad may have left early and not been very involved, and later he becomes the best friend and mom gets kicked to the curb. And sometimes it's just a way for the child to separate from mom. Okay, mistake number 3, qualifying your amends through explanation, persuasion, or defensiveness. If you've read my book, I talk a lot about the importance of making amends. So we all make mistakes as parents. If your kid starts complaining, whether it's through parental alienation syndrome or some other thing or some other kind of mistake that you've made, it's important just to kind of take the hit. And, if you've made mistakes, then own it and empathize with the child. So what I recommend is that parents at least speak to the kernel of truth in the child's complaints. It's kind of like marriage, right? If your spouse says, "Oh, you're always a lazy slob," I mean, maybe you're not always a lazy slob, but maybe 10% of the time you are. So, you want to speak to the part where there is some truth, because you want to diffuse it, and you won't diffuse it by being defensive. You'll actually increase the tension. So what do I mean by qualifying? I mean saying things like, well, I did the best I could, or it's not my fault that, your other parent was never there, or, well, it's all your mother's fault because she's just always poisoning you about me, or you were difficult, or you don't remember any of the good times, your memories of me are all wrong. So you want to go for some kind of a kernel of truth. I mean, this was when I was going through it with my daughter, one of my daughter's complaints was I remarried about 25 years ago, and I have twin sons from that marriage, and they're 20 now. And she felt displaced when I got remarried. She felt kind of like the unwanted stepchild. She felt like her brothers, my sons, got a much better childhood experience than did she. And she's right. I mean, there was a bunch of other things going on, but that's a valid complaint. So when she would say that, I mean, she would put it in a way that was hard to stomach and would make me feel really sad and upset. She'd say, well, you were self-centered, or you neglected me, or you didn't care what was going on with me. Now, none of that is true. But it is true. I could easily see how she could have felt like that. I mean, my boys grew up in an intact marriage. I had more money at that point. They had a very healthy, stable mother and family situation. So, the first 10 times I would hear it, it would take every ounce of my willpower to not be defensive and not blame and not excuse. But, I knew the only thing I could say was, I'm really sorry. I could see how you felt that was really selfish of me. I really regret that. I wish I could have done it differently. And you did suffer a lot as a result of that. I mean, it's hard to kind of argue with that. I mean, a kid might, but they're going to respect that you take the hit. So again, let me reinforce the idea that if you think you don't have a character flaw or didn't make mistakes as a parent, you're seriously wrong. You're going to be blamed at some point, whatever the cause, for causing your child some pain, and you will actually gain their respect and their interest. The more you can just kind of, in a flat-footed way, cop to it, take responsibility, not act too wounded by it, not act too morally outraged about it, not diss your ex, because it's just going to backfire. And now, how am I doing time-wise? 10 minutes. Okay, that's not too bad. So let's see. So one of the ways that you do this is to distinguish between what you tell your child and your own self-dialogue. You can't expect your child to soothe you when you're in this period of heartbreak and heartache and anger. They can't do it. They're not going to be able to do it. Maybe years after a reconciliation, you'll hear some things that'll make you feel better or like they understood. So you have to soothe yourself, basically. So if you're being wrongly accused of something, or just accused of something where there's a kernel of truth, you have to remind yourself. You have to say to yourself, well, I did the best that I could, or I was in this awful situation, or I was a victim of parental alienation syndrome, or she's forgetting, or he's forgetting, my child's forgetting all the wonderful ways that I was a parent, or all the things that I did do. You have to tell that to yourself. You can't tell that to your kid. You're going to just shut them down. But it's good to tell it to yourself because it will calm you down and enable you to do that. You have to soothe yourself. So it'd be more fair if you got empathy from your child, but don't expect it because you're not going to get it. I'm sorry. Not once you're into estrangement zone, it's a whole new set of rules. So it's just probably not going to happen, and that's part of what makes this whole thing so challenging. The other way to think about this that can be helpful for parents is to think about the separate realities nature of family life. In every family, there's, if you have 5 people in a family, you probably have 5 different versions of what's going on. I have 2 brothers, and when I get together with my brothers, they have very different ideas about who my parents were. Some more sympathetic, some less, but very, very different. And our experience in a family is a kind of a mix of a bunch of things. Our psychological temperament, which may make us more difficult, more rebellious, more thin-skinned, more aggressive, and that could be true of us as parents as well. We may have really misinterpreted our children's behavior for that reason. So when your child says these things, it's good to just come from the perspective of that's what they felt, that's what they think. Even if it's a parental alienation syndrome where they're telling you things that you think are planted, I'm never suggesting that you say, yes, that was true. If there's some kernel of truth to it, then fine. But if you're accused of molesting your child, then what I tell parents is to say is something like, I can tell you with 100% authority and confidence that never happened. I'm not psychologically capable of molesting any child, particularly my own. So I can say, that actually never happened. I don't know how you got that idea. But on the other hand, so you always want to go back to them. It's not about you, it's about them. So you very quickly want to go back to why they're feeling like that without maligning the other parent. So you might say something like, but I think sometimes children have memories for a variety of reasons. Sometimes people tell them things. You could say people, not a parent. But you might also say sometimes kids have complaints about their parents, and it's one way to remember that. Maybe there were other ways that you felt very mistreated by me, and you're remembering it in that way. Okay. Just don't get into the right and wrong of it. Once you get into the right and the wrong of it, the game is over. So the next, I guess I've got a few more minutes. I'll kind of run through the last 2. The number 4 is returning fire with fire. Your kid gets furious at you, you get furious back. I mean, I'm horrified by some of the things that parents tell me that their kids of any age have said to them. There's so much contempt and sarcasm and hostility. It's very, very hard for a parent not to return fire with fire, but you really don't want to. You really want to be as flat-footed as possible, take deep breaths, do self-soothing, in the interaction, get off the phone, do whatever you need to do. Mistake number 5 is failing to see how long reconciliation can take. It really is more like a marathon, as somebody said. So you can't really hope for a short solution because it's in all likelihood going to take a lot of time. And a related thing is to not recognize progress when it occurs. To not recognize the little things, like you get a text back or a card or some small kind of thing. The more you get of those, even if they're occasional, it's a good sign that there's some kind of thing that's going on to keep the two of you close. And the final bonus mistake is assuming that it's all about you. This is particularly true with adult children. Adult children are on a very different trajectory than are their parents. They're They're working on their careers, their own marriages, their own, maybe they're in college, maybe they're parenting. You know, we get to a certain age, all of us, our children are our primary obsession or focus. Not so our parents. I mean, think of yourself, I mean, if you have a kid that's, say, older than 18 or something. I mean, most of us didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about our parents. We were very much more preoccupied with our own lives. So the same is true of our children. And so much of what can seem like is personal in this domain actually isn't necessarily personal. Now, some of it is, but often a lot of it isn't. But if you make it personal and it's not personal, then it does become a problem. So why don't I stop here? I've got a few more minutes left and take some questions. Well, yeah, let me refine that. Did you, I interrupted you, go ahead. Did you want to say more?
Well, I should say, try to control, there's something you want, like, it's in text, and it's love you.
Yeah.
But you're saying it's right now.
Well, I'm glad you asked that because let me refine that. No, I think it's perfectly fine to do it as long as you're not acting too wounded. You don't want your child to feel like they're devastating you, particularly with parental alienation syndrome. I mean, they're being brainwashed. So, you know, you don't want to act, they're going to feel guilty if they feel, even though they look cold and cut off, they actually aren't feeling that way. They actually feel hugely guilty and upset underneath that. So you don't want to make them feel like they're ruining your lives. So you wouldn't necessarily want to, in general, cry a lot in front of your children. Maybe on occasion it would be okay. It's fine to say, I miss you, I love you, I can't wait to see you, I want to see your face, I want to kiss you. That's fine, but you know, the more kind of upbeat you can do it, the more you can show your child that that you're doing fine, they don't have to worry about you, they don't have to take care of you, the better it's going to go. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, actually, I found that a major component is lack of respect for you from all the messages.
Yeah.
So I often advise parents in therapy to induce respect by sometimes indifference.
Mm-hmm.
The opposite of, oh, let's engage in this sort of constant effort to move the frontier forward and breach the trenches and so on. To disengage. Say,
Yeah.
okay, do your stuff, I'm doing my stuff.
Yep.
We'll see you, call me when you can.
Yeah.
Almost indifference to the alienation. How do you think about that?
I think it's a good point, and it highlights that, you know, there's no one-size-fits-all to these recommendations. I bet if I went down the line here, I would have 10 different recommendations based on 10 different families, but you're raising an important point that in many cases you should reach out and be very consistent and show availability, but sometimes it's helpful to, particularly with older children, but even sometimes for younger children, to pull back and create a vacuum and kind of have them miss you a little bit. In some ways, there's some truth in family life that they can't miss you if you're always there. Now, if I'm going to advise a parent in a general way, would be to err more on the side of being too loving than being too distant. But there is certainly a place as you're raising for that. And I got the end sign, so I guess I'll have to stop and thank you all for listening.
Okay, we're almost done here today. And I'm Mike Kanzaki. I'm on the board and the committee here for the planning of this conference. I was an alienated dad. I no longer am. Thank you. Right there. I would think that sorry. I would like to believe that I'm no longer an alienated dad because of this. the support organization, the education that I've received. And one of the big contributors to that is our next speaker. So Dr. Michael Bowen. He's been doing parental alienation consulting and clinical assessments for over 20 years, primarily consulting. He's also been in research consultation and served on a number of boards. He has provided expert testimony and has authored countless scholarly articles and papers, and has lectured in the U.S., Canada, Western Europe. He's been interviewed on a number of radio and talk programs, and recently his work has kind of focused on presenting parental alienation cases to the family court in a logical manner to produce healing remedies. Please, we've waited all day for this. Please help me welcome Dr. Michael Bowen.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. I must say your attentiveness is stunning as I sit here all day long, but then I think the presenters and the information that has been delivered so far is also stunning, so it makes very good sense. As a matter of fact, I've gotten all kinds of ideas from things I've heard, and I'm tempted to launch off in all these tangents, but I promise I won't do that because I've contracted to talk about this, although I'm very interested in this topic, very much so. The last, Dr. Coleman's comments about the way we are family-wise, children-wise, et cetera, at this moment in history is to me fascinating. And I believe, I had this conversation at a conference a couple days ago, that I believe that where we are as a societal moment really makes the alienation process much, much more easily accomplished, because the things that once held communities together was community, and that really has become fragmented hugely, more in the United States than a lot of other places in the world, but I think that's a big backstory to everything we're talking about. But let me get on to what I want to talk about here today. As you can cleverly see that I've titled this 3 areas of focus. I really want to talk about 3 different things today. The first one has to do with the nature of the family court and the nature of the fact that it operates with a bias to protect, which it needs to, and that sets up certain circumstances that are easily exploited in cases where parental alienation is involved. The second thing I want to talk about is how to deliver the information, the story of the alienation in the particular case, and about basically the art of storytelling. I think there is something that to be learned about this, and I think great attorneys understand this intuitively very, very well, and that's a real talent and an art. Then the third thing I want to talk about are basically the other various roles that we see in these cases, having to do with guardians and things such as that. And I think there are some specific things to be aware of and to be wary of when it comes to dealing with some of the, as I started to say, the usual suspects, but that seemed sort of disrespectful, so I just left it with the usual players. So what in the world entitles me to talk about this? I'm not a lawyer. And so what in the world is this all about? And I began to think about it, and I do have an answer for that. Since about, well, for the last great many years, 20 plus years, I've been involved primarily with this problem of parental alienation. In the last 7 or 8 years, I've been exclusively involved with this problem in a consultative basis. And what that means is I'm sort of the invisible guy behind a lot of the cases involving going on. And what that does, that has exposed me, and I've seen hundreds. I've tried to think about how many cases involving parental alienation in the courts I've been involved with in various levels of depth, and it's probably, I don't know, I'm guessing several hundred. So just because of this, I've just sort of witnessed a lot of stuff. So I began to think, what does this really mean? And I think the model of the anthropologist came to mind. I mean, that's an old first love of mine anyway, anthropology. So the idea of, and I began to think about it, I think, well, this really does make sense, because the way the family court system works really is that of kind of an exotic culture. I mean, I've heard this from many parents over the years saying that basically once I got involved in this environment, it was like the rules were completely different. No one could explain them, and there was just a whole host of things that were like being in an alien environment. The normal things of logic didn't make sense, didn't seem to operate that way, but you were the only one that seemed to think that. Everyone else in the system seemed to understand it exactly. So I think the anthropologist going into an exotic culture really is a model that fits here. Also, one of the things an anthropologist must do when studying an exotic culture, more so 50 years ago than now, there are not many of those left anymore, but the first thing you have to do is learn the language. And that's when you have to learn the language of how the family court system works, and that's its own project in and of itself. So I think it's a model that really does make sense, but it's from that perspective that I basically want to report back to you what I've found. In the cases that work, all the cases that don't work, but there really is a consistent pattern when these cases do turn around. And I'm going to use a couple of sort of striking examples as we go. Just as a quick backdrop, if we look at what are the basic criteria, I co-authored an article many years ago now where we posited that there were 4 components present in all cases involving parental alienation. I really believe this is still pretty valid. I've never dealt with a case that didn't have all of these. And if you only have 3, it doesn't seem to be the same thing. All 4 in the way they interlace does do something that qualitatively pushes it over that tipping point, I believe anyway. The first one, access and visitation blocking. We've heard about that in various capacities already today. The second one, false allegations of abuse. I've emboldened this because that's really the heart of the matter that we'll deal with in the court system. The third component is the deterioration in the relationship between the child or children and the targeted parent, which is the consequence of the first 2. And then the fear reaction of displeasing the alienating or aligned parent would be the 4th criteria. That is also expressed as an enmeshment where a child is parentified and made to be is emotionally responsible for that parent. So those are the things in my view, we always see in these cases. But the one I really want to address is the false allegations of abuse. But first, let's take a half step back. The family court system, as I said before, really must protect children from any possibility of abuse or danger. I mean, childhood abuse does exist. It's a horrible thing. We can't deny it. We don't want to deny it. The critics of parental alienation, and especially parental alienation syndrome, claim that, this is just a shield to hide behind abusers. That's completely without foundation in any way, shape, or form. Anybody that's ever worked in this field knows that the first thing you have to do is critically assess the allegations of there having been a bad incident or incidents or a pattern of that. Have to be carefully, independently assessed. So as a consequence of the bias to protect, we have we naturally see the court erring on the side of caution. We hear a lot of the phrase out of an abundance of caution, that we're going to do this as opposed to not do that. And so when all this put together, what that results in is that the bias to protect invites manipulation and exploitation. It absolutely does. And they have a field day with it, and that's one of the big problems, one of the first things we confront in dealing with one of these cases across the board is that. I've selected just a few comments about Dwayne Wade, the NBA basketball star who plays for the Miami Heat. He was from Chicago. He was embroiled in a custody dispute that lasted in excess of 4 years. In the process of that, he was accused of harmful neglect, abuse in every way, shape, or form by the former wife, now the former wife, it wasn't at that time. And this is the real challenge was the court appointed, you can imagine the budget on this kind of thing. I mean, the court had set aside like a ridiculous amount of money, and so all these people were involved in the evaluation process, and the court appointed a psychiatrist who did a report, 150 pages long, that did a very careful evaluation, lots in testing and all sorts of collateral investigations, and basically then came up with a recommendation that it doesn't appear that this guy is a danger to anybody, and there was no reputable information to support that whatsoever. And one certainly got the feeling that the evaluator was very much in Dwayne Wade's camp as far as a custodial, being a primary custodial parent. However, because the boys were young, 4 and 6 roughly at the time, and she had been the primary parent all the time, the court felt like, no, we know this, she's doing some bad stuff, but we need to keep it more with her because it would be too traumatic. One of the things we hear all the time, the trauma of separating. And I think it's always important to inject the point that the kind of closeness, and it was referenced a couple times earlier today, the kind of closeness and bonding that we see between a truly alienated child and a parent ain't a good thing. It's an unhealthy bonding, it's enmeshed, it's a conditional kind of attachment. It's a very strong attachment, but it's a very unhealthy kind of attachment. Think of Patty Hearst. Think of the Branch Davidians. Think of those are unhealthy bonding. So I think it's important to the court that it be pointed out how unhealthy this kind of a parent-close bonding is. So anyway, that's one of the things cited by the report. The other thing, basically, as an NBA superstar, I'd learned a little bit about superstars in that regard. He had lots of these guys, especially at that level, have lots of other contracts that they have, endorsement. So they're all over the place doing photo shoots and stuff like that. So between his schedule and his other activities, the evaluator felt like, well, this is something that just couldn't reasonably support him being the primary custodial parent. And now we got this thing going on. Okay. That's all right. We'll soldier through this. The strategy to overcome this, basically this is just sort of and I'll repeat this a few times probably in different ways. I think we had to show, first of all, what an involved father he had been, which he really had been. All these strategies, by the way, are simply a way to distill down the truth. None of it's manipulative. None of it is trying to spin something more than it really was. It's just simply a way to get the truth out. The rules of evidence in the family court system really serve to make it difficult to do that very often. Because of all the rules of evidence, there has to be situated in just a particular kind of way. So that's a real challenge. It's like a filter. Getting the information through the filters is sometimes very, very difficult. So the direct fact witness testimony, people that were there, and we'll talk about the storytelling part shortly. That was a very important part, to show the court, beyond his own direct testimony, but to show the court how involved he was, how even on a most minute level, he was a very busy guy, but whenever he had a spare moment, that's where he was. That's in being able to show that his testimony, other people's testimony, etc. People that didn't have a dog in the fight, people that were child caregivers, and so on and so forth. Also, the direct examination, direct testimony of him, this always gives the court a chance to see who this person is. I cannot stress how important that is. I believe that to be a very, very important component is a couple of things. One, showing the court who this person really is. All these terrible allegations have happened, and you have the judge up there, and I always remind people that the person in the courtroom that knows the least about the case is the judge. Because of the rules of evidence, that's the way it's supposed to be. So when you have a situation with two warring parties, one sitting at this table and one sitting at that table, and you don't know what it's about, you're relying on the information that has to get through the rules of evidence filter in order to make some decision. I believe that the default setting for family court judges is to assume equal culpability. These are just two people who can't get along. They hate each other more than they love their children. You see those comments. You'll see judges order therapy like Brian. I mean, therapy's handed out like M&Ms, assuming that to be the panacea, and it rarely is in that conventional kind of way. So as a consequence, you have let's see, let me get to the next part actually. As a consequence, we find that the evidence that it needs to be put on to the judge is to get the judge to realize that, in fact, this is not two people who can't get along. What this is one party setting things up then the other party simply has to react to it or lose their relationship. So that's the story that needs to be told to correct that. So in order to do so, without that, the person in the targeted parent's position is left simply always defending themselves. And many of you, I'm sure, have had that experience. Defending, proving a false negative, I don't believe is difficult. I believe it's impossible because there's no absolute proof, and that's what proof implies is absolute. But I think there's a difference between that and getting a court to understand and believe what's going on. So as a consequence of those various dynamics, I think it's important to realize that what we really need to do is get the court to understand the dynamic. The next thing, the assertive defense of false allegations of abuse in direct testimony. What that means is when the person who's been accused is able to be on the stand and get the court to get the feel for who they are, and I think the direct testimony can do that under the right circumstances. And I think that in this particular case, that was very effective. Dwayne Wade's a very personable and genuine kind of person, and was able to withstand any kind, even the withering cross-examination testimony, because there wasn't any basis for any merit for it. Also, we did an analysis. I actually did a spreadsheet of the time based on his schedule of these various responsibilities, and I didn't know where this was going to end up, but it turns out that even with his crazy busy schedule, the actual time he spent doing, whether it be practice, basketball game, photo shoot, whatever, the direct activity wasn't terribly different with people with banker's hours, strangely enough. There were a lot of airplane flights in between, but we were able to show that with enough help from family, his family members and other people, this is something that could be pulled off. And then finally, the coup de grace is the exposure of the alienating parent. This is, in my view, the most important thing that can be said about these. Whenever these cases do get resolved and the court gets it right and you see the light bulb goes on, you can see the light bulb go on. It's like they're looking suspiciously at this table over here who's been accused of this and that terrible thing. And then finally when the light bulb goes out, you can just see them start looking in the direction and begin to wonder, have I been duped? And you can imagine, I mean, that's the goal, is to get the court to think, have I been duped? And to get the court to recognize and identify with, everybody's probably been blamed for something they haven't done in their lives. It's a terrible feeling, but being able to get the court, the judge, to have that experience resonate with them, within themselves, that's the goal. But in terms of exposure of that, the alienating parent's agenda, behavior, etc., very often it's their own testimony. Very often it's their own testimony that may go on quite a while, and they'll very often end up hanging themselves. There was a comment made earlier, actually several times, maybe it was Brian, I think, that may have said this, that alienators will eventually do themselves in. The hubris that comes from always getting away with it, accusing something but always getting away with it again, after a while they develop a hubris that makes them make errors and mistakes. And I think that's what you want to be able to expose. In this particular case, and again, this is atypical because it's a kind of a celebrity deal, but in this particular case, the mother of his children, Dwayne Wade's former wife, was actually this was on cross-examination testimony for 8.5 days. Now just think about that. It's over a week, 8 hours a day, testifying. And the strategy that we developed was basically ask a lot of, based on her psychological profile, or anybody in that position's profile, very often is ask a lot of sort of open-ended questions and just let them talk, let them talk, let them talk. And that's what happened. And I believe that's one of the key things that led the court to begin to realize, wait a minute, I can't expect this to work out well if these children are primarily with this person who really cannot control themselves either even in the context of the court. So with all that being said, I think that what I'm really saying is you have to get the court to develop a warm and fuzzy relationship, rebrand the targeted parent so the court can see who they are, and then the other part is to expose the alienating parent for their role in this whole setup process. The first, just to go back to repeat a little bit, the first part about getting the court to understand who the targeted parent really is, sometimes I believe that gets underestimated in terms of its importance from what I've seen. When I hear from an attorney, that allegation of abuse, that was unfounded, we can just move on. It may be unfounded, but it leaves a hovering cloud of suspicion about that, and that other side will exploit it. There's no question about it. So I believe you have to attack it directly, to expose it, to show that it was, in effect, you're saying, Your Honor, not only did this not happen, but what did happen was it was a setup. It was made up. It was made to create a tactical advantage in a custody dispute, and find different ways to be able to say that with direct and cross-examination testimony. And I think we'll get to that shortly. So, let's see, what's the last thing I have there? I'm just kind of repeating that. So therefore, the things that we do that help to overcome the barriers in this kind of thing is affirmative reframing of the false abuse allegations. And that's just a sort of a long-winded way of saying, helping the exposing for what it was. It was a sham. It's a frame. It's that sort of thing. And being able to put it in those terms. Not just, it didn't happen. He's not really dangerous, Your Honor. It was dropped. DCF dropped the whole thing, and he was arrested, but he wasn't charged. And that's not enough. That's half the story. That might even be 25% of the story. The most important part is saying, but what did happen, it was an entire setup. And you show it over and over, so you get the court, you get the judge beginning to think, oh, here we go again. Here it's happening again, developing a pattern of that. And I think it's also important to have a thematic, a theme that can be in each case that I think the attorney can bring up in opening statement and also repeat over and over in direct and cross-examination testimony. We'll get to the... So the two-step operation I referred to, I'm just repeating myself now because I think it is important, is to first of all show that the allegation was untrue, that it does not pose danger, but then also number two, to say that what is true is that this person was essentially victimized. I'm careful about how to use that, but I think if there was ever such thing as a victimization, boy, this is it. I mean, the system is poised that way. It's not intended to be that way, but that's the way where the rubber hits the road very often. Okay, now I'm really repeating myself. Must expose the bias to protect is manipulated. That sometimes will get a judge pretty excited. Basically, and just to go on with that, they're showing how the manipulation constitutes a defrauding of the court and the entire system. I mean, what I've seen judges become really upset by that. And when I first learned how many family law cases there are, and how many, at first family law judges sometimes I would be irritated by their reaction because it's like they would get angry about having to make a judgment. And I would think, well, they're a judge, supposed to make a judgment. But in fact, these cases are the ones that have boxes of documents accompanying them. It's a small number of cases, but they're well known in the court system. And you can just see the judge rolling his eyes. So then they come back again for some intermediate hearing about something or other. You can just see the judge get more and more kind of upset about it. And it's not an excuse, but it's a reason, because of all the thousands of other cases that don't get heard because of this one. But so you can use that frustration to have and sculpt it into what it really is, and that is the court realizing that, wait a minute, I'm getting kind of screwed here. This is not what's really going on, and we're being exploited. So I think the idea of moving in that direction is what is important. I think also, and then this can be done in direct and cross-examination testimony, maybe equally, is to show how the children are being used as pawns in the fraud of the court. And they really are. I mean, we all know that. That's what this is all about. So that's, I think, the sort of the whole rounded off piece as far as the family court must be protective, and that protectiveness actually causes the vulnerability that I think we all know very much, all too well. Okay, telling the story to the court. Storytelling is a unique human perspective. Years ago, I did a talk to a bunch of engineers at Westinghouse, And they said, I was called and they said, Mike, I want you to talk to a bunch of engineers about progress. And I thought, well, these are the purveyors of progress. But they said, don't make it too mental healthy, okay? Because they'll leave the room. I said, okay. So I calculated if I had a ball of string and the last 4 inches of the string represented 2,000 years, how long would the ball of string be at the beginning of human forms, Australopithecus, 3.5 million years ago, roughly? The ball of string would have been about 2 football fields, 600 feet, okay? Now, the last 4 inches of that ball of string represent literacy, the birth of Christ, the modern civilization. Really much prior to that, none of that existed. But human beings existed, and the only way they passed on their culture, their whole sense of reality and being human, was through oral tradition, storytelling. That's what we were born to do. And that's how we tell people who we are. So I think this is something very important and basic in order to get this information in the first part I talked about into getting that into the mind of the court. Because storytelling is something that causes the audience to resonate with if it's done properly, and gets the audience to identify with. Let's see, wiring to emphasize danger. What did I mean there? Oh, I know. Because of the way we're wired and how the primacy of certain parts of our brain, especially the amygdala, we heavily weight stories involving danger. It's a survival tactic that's been around forever. So if there's any incoming story about danger, we pay more attention to that than we do if it's something about just all sweetness and light. So that we are wired self-protectively to be able to hear that loudly. The volume goes up when we hear those stories. So you can see in these kinds of environment of false allegations how that's going to play to the audience. And like, oh, this is serious. Also, I added the point mirror neurons. In the early 90s, there was research done, I think by accident, in Italy that found out that when we do certain things, if I'm watching you pick up a glass of water, and then I think about picking up that glass of water, the same neurons will fire within me that are firing within you as you pick up that glass of water. It's been carried a little further now to say, well, this mean also a mirroring of empathy? And I think that's still debated. I don't really know, but it sure is interesting. I mean, I think, as was the comment made earlier, we are all connected in this life experience, and we really are. And neurologically, we know more about that than we ever had. So that's another reason to stress the importance of how you tell the story. Detail. When you tell stories, there's got to be detail. I brought some examples of some before and after things we'll talk about very shortly. That's where the resonance for emotion resides, in the detail. And I remember years ago, I used to teach at the New School in New York, and I taught this course on literacy, the significance of literacy on a psychological kind of basis. And I got people to read these horribly graphic things. I don't know, there's a Japanese writer named Yukio Mishima, who was the guy, I remember Life magazine, where he committed seppuku and committed suicide in protest of the westernization of Japan. But he was a very gifted writer, and he wrote some of them. I mean, I guarantee if you read some of these passages, you'll start to get nauseous. So I would have students read these things and then write about them. And the detail of what he described in that really was where the affective response came from, this incredible detail. So that's another important element of the story. Then, sort of a philosophical term, the concrete universal. I mean, if you think about it, mythology talks about specific people, but the reason that it's mythological and that we think about it today, thousands and thousands of years later, is because even though it was about these gods or these pre-universe activities, it resonates within it. So it's a universal theme that is depicted in a concrete way. That's an important element of the storytelling too. The parental alienation has what I refer to as interlacing themes. These are there's several ways of saying much of the same thing with emphasis on certain aspects of it. The false allegations obviously have to do directly with the vilification of the targeted parent. I mean, that's just straight off the bat, and we all know what that can do. That's not terribly subtle, but it's something that spreads pretty quickly in various kinds of reporting, be it through agencies or neighbors or overhearing things on telephone conversations, et cetera, et cetera. And again, the aspects of much of the same dynamic, but the persuasive rhetoric, which I'll mention here, is the phenomenon of, I ask you if you know something about person B. No, I don't know person B. Well, I heard this story about person B, da-da-da-da-da. Then I see somebody else. Do you hear about person B? Then the first person I talk to says, oh yeah, I heard about that guy. Now there are 3 voices in the chorus, and it grows and grows and grows. And that's like a cancer in this environment. I'm going to just read you a little quick story here. I think it's kind of cool. Socrates, the story goes, is approached by a man who wants to tell him some urgent news. Before he does this, Socrates stops him and says he would first like to ask him 3 questions before he tells the story. The man agrees. The first question is, do you know the person to whom this news occurred? Answer, no. But I do know somebody who does know him. Question 2, did you witness the event yourself? Answer, no. But I spoke to someone who was there. Question 3, is the news good or bad? Answer, it would be considered bad news. Socrates reviews accordingly. So you do not know the person to whom this happened. You only heard about it from someone who says they were there, and it's bad news. Thank you, but I think I'd rather not listen to this news. I mean, I think we need to somehow engender that more and critically, because we are wired to suck this stuff up like you wouldn't believe out of our bias to look out for danger. So anyway. The next one, understanding the role of confirmatory bias. Confirmatory bias is a process that we all have. It's universal. It has to do with we humans don't like to be confused, and I'll put something in a pattern of familiarity, and I may misinterpret it, but it's a lot better than being confused. So confirmatory bias goes something like this in this context. Well, have you heard about the father? No, he's very angry. He's really excited. He comes across as a nice guy, but look out. He's very excitable. You never know. He's going to blow. You got to be careful, okay? You haven't met the guy. The guy comes in. You meet him. He's a estranged, alienated father, let's say, who begins to talk about what's going on because you're asking these questions about it. And in the process of relaying this information, this father gets excitable. He gets upset. Because of confirmatory bias, unless one is really aware of this, if I'm the person who has been exposed and told this story, I'm going to interpret his excitability as anger and will confirm what I've been told. So that runs rampant in these cases. By spreading that kind of news around by basically persuasive rhetoric, and then suddenly they walk in the room and what do you have? You got, oh yeah, because now the person who's a victim of this feels isolated, alienated, and that is no good place for we humans to be. So I think you can see all these things kind of work together. Drafting soldiers to the cause. I'm not really sure what I meant by that. I must have been inspired, but I think this is the consequence. Yes, you have a suggestion.
Well, it's not that point, it's Peter's point, because I've noticed that sometimes the alienating parent is very clever in manipulating that very excitability stereotype. The danger, target parent, he gets out of control. And of course, if you work with that targeted parent so as to get them out of control, you've got a huge confirmatory bias that
Yes.
will come later in the course.
Exactly. Then it becomes something that gets reaffirmed to their mother. Now we have several witnesses to it, so it must be true. But it's really, again, the theme is the setup. And I'll get back to your question. I'll get right at the end there, if you don't mind. Okay, so that's what I must have meant by drafting soldiers into the cause. Thank you. Okay, the story economy. Boy, this is tough. The challenge of getting 20 pounds in a 2-pound bag. Or another way of saying this, you've got a jigsaw puzzle with 1,000 pieces, but you can only use 12. And you still have to depict what the picture is. Okay? So that's what we use the themes in the last slide to try to use those to boil that down. So basically, you develop the theme by way of the storytelling, which we'll get to, but then you want the audience, the court, to be going, oh, here we go again, oh, it's happening again. And you could even say, oh, she's at it again, or he's at it again. It could just as easily be an alienating father. Then also, telling the story at a 4th grade level. I think it's important that it be succinct and it be emotionally driven and the kind of thing that can be told simply. We want people to be in their emotional part of their brain, not in their executive function part of their brain. We want it in the right hemisphere more than the left hemisphere. So it has to be something that is fairly powerful emotionally. So I think all those themes are important. Okay. And I'm going to go through these just as examples, and I'll give you a before and after example of each one of these. The overall vilification theme, that's the general overarching thing. There's a wide range of distortion in this. I've seen, I think it's probably more effective if the targeted parent is portrayed as being horrible in every which way. It's harder to sell that, but once you sell it, it's really difficult to get out of that one. The other distribution of that is, well, they changed. In other words, they were fine until the separation, then they fell on their head or something and became a different person, and being able to explain something like that. So the vilification part of that is, I think, is where'd it go? Okay, I'm sorry, I haven't got to that part yet. So the development of the distorted, vilified profile of the targeted parent, that's what we have. And in order to basically choose the incidents that describe this, it's a matter of selection of specific incidents. And what I'm talking about here is when you're talking with an alienated, a targeted parent, and when I have seen attorneys work well with this so that it works effectively in the court, there is a lot of time spent preparing and going over and going over and going over. When I've worked directly with, we'll take a particular incident, and by helping that parent be able to describe it more fully in a way that resonates, not distorting anything, not changing anything, just making it more resonant, that's really a very powerful kind of thing. One of the things that I like to put in sort of the back of my mind in cases such as this is that sort of develop a brief list of all the negative characteristics of the targeted parent as they're being portrayed by the alienating parent. For example, and they're typically a handful of things. Typically it has to do with they're selfish, they're unstable, they're dangerous, they're neglectful, there's things like that. You see the themes over and over and over again. So I sort of make a list of those things, and then when it comes time to, with that targeted parent, to describe specific incidents that display qualities of the relationship, we keep that list handy. For example, if part of the list is this guy is really self-centered, or this parent is really self-centered, what we'll want to do is select incidents that happened that show that they were the opposite of self-centered. So you don't even address it directly, you do it more indirectly. And it's more effective on an emotional level because we want the judge to have a sense of revelation about it. Oh, this guy didn't sound that way at all. Than we do because it's more effective the less apparent that it is. We want to convey and transfer that information across from the testimony to the judge, but we want to do it in a way that lets them have the light bulb go on. Psychotherapy is based on the same thing, if you think about it. I read a linguistic study many years ago that I haven't been able to find since, but I remember it enough to be able to relate to you this. There was a linguistic analysis of how people talk about themselves measured against how long they had been in therapy. And what the results showed was that the longer somebody was in therapy, the more they talked about themselves like their therapist talked about them. Information transfer. But for psychotherapy, it's got to be experienced as an insight, as a revelation. The therapist can tell the person, oh, you're this way, that way, and that's not nearly as effective as the person thinking, oh, man, I'm really that way. You can see how it feels different, and it feels more genuine. That's the reaction we want the judge to have. So if somebody is described as being self-centered, we have them select times when they were anything but self-centered, and then help them tell that story at the right moment to the court. And I think that has a way of washing away, eroding that sense of the criticisms against that targeted parent. Let's see. One of the things also, selection of fact witnesses versus expert witnesses, to describe incidents that happen. So again, we have that list of all the negatives that the parent is supposed to be, And then we make selections of, well, this neighbor can describe an incident that was completely unlike that, and we help them be able to tell the story of that incident. So then you string all these fact witnesses together, each carefully selecting specific incidents to tell the story. It works together very well in a pretty resounding way. I didn't know where to put this slide, so I just put it here. This is sort of a tool that has been shown to be helpful. Think of it as sort of a 3-column sheet. One of the things that happens in these cases is that there's a tremendous amount of lies, tremendous amount of distortion, as we all know. And there's something powerful about developing a visual that is a date, incident, and then the third column is proof that that wasn't the case based on this testimony and this deposition, based on what this other person said, based on the fact that he was out of the country, he couldn't have done that, whatever. But there's something very powerful about having some sort of document like that that can be shown. And it goes on for pages. It goes on for pages. Again, that's part of exposing the alienating parent for what they're up to, really. And I think Brian could certainly comment on that in terms of cross-examining and sort of, if you've ever experienced that, where that sort of, the mask gets pulled off, it's very powerful. And I think this is a tool, and I didn't know where to put this slide, so I just put it here. Okay, now selecting the stories, the bad-mouthing theme of, I said pejorative, I meant to say persuasive, but maybe that was just a Freudian slip, because it really, in this case, persuasive is pejorative. And the goal is to show the others, meaning the judge, that they've been duped, as I said before. I'll give you an example of this. The police are called to protect against potential violence, and police become witnesses for the targeted parent. This is based on cases involved, and I've sort of transformed elements of it to mask the identity and so forth. But this is how it started out. I said, well, tell me about when this happened. This is the response. She makes me out to be dangerous and tried to have me arrested at the kids' award ceremony. Not much, it's like, okay, that's terrible. That's terrible. This is what it ended up being, sort of. I mean, this is just sort of a paraphrase. I went to the award ceremony. This is him telling the story now. I went to the kids' award ceremony. She would not let me come over to speak. She would not let them come over to speak to me. And as I walked up to them, my daughter started to cry. Then I noticed that a police officer was watching me. I later learned that she'd called the cops, meaning the ex-wife, suggesting that my being there might be a danger. Anyway, I went up to my daughter and picked her up and was talking to her, and I noticed that the cop had gotten closer. He apparently was close enough to overhear my conversation with my daughter, and I guess he could see that I was only trying to console her and find out why she was crying. After she came more composed, I put her down as the ceremony was starting. The cop then comes up to me and lets me know that he basically saw that I was only trying to find out why she was so upset and to comfort her. The cop and I talked more at some length after the ceremony was over, and he ended up testifying on my behalf, saying that also that the mother was essentially hoping I would react in some negative way and possibly be arrested, since he had already been told that I was violent, confirmatory bias, which I had never been. He could see that I was being set up and told the judge that. So you can see from the first part, she makes me out to be dangerous and tried to have me arrested, and then versus the story that you just heard, it just is so much more complete. You could picture it. Did you notice, as I was describing that, could you sort of picture some of what that's an important part, is firing those mirror neurons, if that's the ones involved, to be able to experience what is being described. The first thing I read to you couldn't do that. There wasn't enough detail, was there? So, I mean, this is the kind of thing but as we'll talk about shortly, I mean, this takes a lot of preparation and practice to be able to sit down and go, well, did it happen this way, or say a little more like that, and so on. Again, not changing the reality, not lying, not distorting anything, but simply providing more in the way of a resonating content for the court to digest. Okay, confirmatory bias. The goal in this is to basically show how easily we as humans are fooled. Here in the example I've extracted for this one is school turned against a targeted parent due to untrue allegations related by an alienating parent. This is how it started out. I went to my kids' school, and was treated very negatively by them. And it took a call from my lawyer for them to let me see their records. They'd never even met me. That's how it started. Here's how it sort of ended up, sort of. This, again, for his direct testimony. What happened in that incident, Mr. So-and-so? Right after we moved to the new town, my wife and I ended up separating. I guess I was hoping the move would help, but I guess it didn't. Anyway, after we got separated, I wanted to know about the kids' schoolwork and extracurricular activities. This was a new school for them, and I had always been very involved in their old school before we moved. Anyway, when I went into the office of the new school, I was treated like I was some sort of criminal. As soon as I said who I was, the lady behind the desk became not very helpful. It seemed like she was afraid of me. Confirmatory bias. I asked her to see the records, such as the ER contact pickup forms, and she would not even let me see them. So I called my lawyer, and he got on the phone with the school principal, and they ended up letting me see this form. On it, I saw that I was listed as the biological father, but that I could not pick up the kids because I was considered some sort of risk that was being sorted out by the courts. That's a good one, sorted out by the courts. Absolutely none of this was true. Again, err on the side of caution. None of this was true. It was all made up, but I guess the school people believed that I was some sort of a danger because they sure acted like it. I think this may also have something to do with the kids not seeming open to talk about school with me. Maybe they were exposed to these negative, untrue things said, or maybe the school personnel acted differently with them when my name came up. Like maybe they had to be protected or something. Doesn't that tell you can be in? I'm in the office. I can picture the office. I can picture this whole scene, and that's the part. I mean, there's a more of emotional response, right? You're all. That's. I think that's the point. Okay, drafting others into the cause, and asking them to be the savior. Showing how easily we're made to believe the duped therapist who vilifies the father with the child while allegedly doing therapy. There's a lot of this. Here's the before story. My ex took the kids to a therapist and did not tell me about it. She told the therapist all sorts of negative and false things about me so that my son would side with his mother. Okay? That's one that many people experience. I know therapists get drawn into this all the time and are vulnerable, typically with the best of intention, to becoming part of the problem. Happens constantly. But here's how the story, with work, here's how the story was told, again, in direct testimony. I had begun to notice that when my son was with me for visitation, he was more distant. I would ask him if he was okay, and he would say yes, but he still was kind of distant. It's like he was kind of suspicious of me. This is very strange. We'd always been very close. Anyway, after my lawyer got some insurance records from the other side, I realized that my son had been taken to a therapist by his mother, who did not tell me. I later found out that when she first took him to the therapist, that she stayed in the office with my son for the first few sessions, and the therapist began to ask my son about the bad things I had done to him, when I had never done anything of the sort ever. The therapist had been told all sorts of garbage by my ex before my son ever went to her. So as these sessions proceeded, my son is hearing all these negative things about me which are not true. Like I wanted his mother to have an abortion when she was pregnant with him, which could not be further from the truth. Then she had apparently told the therapist that I had some kind of arrest and that I had hit his mother, which of course I never did. But as I learned all of this, I began to see why my son is acting distant and suspicious. This was all a setup designed to make my son wonder about me, and it started to work. Now that, all kinds of layers there, isn't it? I mean, that's something that you can imagine, a judge hearing that. I mean, there's so many layers of so many elements of that story that are contained in that, I think, and all of these that cause the audience, in this case the judge, to react emotionally and begin to wonder what's going on here. And the more of these experiences of setup, that's the theme that's over and over emphasized, the more I begin to understand that. In all cases, the purpose of the story is to convey to the audience, the judge, evaluate. By the way, everything I'm saying could also be applied to preparing one to sit for an evaluation, a custody evaluation, or meeting with the guardian ad litem, or any of the appointees of the court, which we'll get to in the latter part of my comments. but to convey to the audience, whoever they are, how the themes of false vilification are the centerpiece of the case and the only theory of the case that explains it all the aspects of it. But again, you do this with the stories and you don't say this directly. Again, the old principle of psychotherapy, you lead them there and then you shut up and hope they come to the point that you want them to. I think it's the same principle used in sales too, I'm not sure, but I think there's some parallel there. In all cases, the author of the distortion is the alienating parent. Again, without saying it directly, the stories say it. I mean, so oftentimes attorneys will tell alienated, targeted parents, don't say negative stuff about the other parent, because they're likely to think that you just hate the other parent so much and so forth. I think it is important. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I think any absolute blanket advice isn't warranted, but I would say it is important to get the truth out. But there are ways to convey things that have happened without targeting and putting a bullseye on the other parent directly. Yeah, that crazy, did this and that. You don't do that. You tell the story. You give a few examples. And again, when working with these people, I would work hard to select the particular incidents, go over and just tell me stories, tell me things that happened when you've been together and so on and so forth, and then begin to sort of catalog them and see which ones sort of contradict this, which ones contradict that, select them, and prepare them for testimony so when they do go to court, they know they're going to be asked to talk about this incident, they've practiced it. Again, not changing it, not distorting it, but simply distilling it down to its emotional truth, really. So I think that's what I've seen work so far in all these cases. Importing the stories to the court. Fact witnesses. Fact witnesses, of course, their testimony is subject to the rules of evidence, which makes it, you have to be mindful of that and avoid hearsay kinds of things and just describe incidents that have happened. That's all done with practice. Don't say it that way, say it this way. And it's the same thing. You're just saying it in a way that will get past the filter of the rules of evidence. Basically, the fact witnesses tell most of the story. They really create a picture, and a whole series of them doing this that may not take but 20 minutes each, 30 minutes each in many cases, but will tell specific incidents. That creates a picture that you can imagine. If these three things I just described to you were all in the same case, you're probably going to have a pretty negative experience of that other parent, just based on what you've heard so far. And basically, the fact witnesses weave these stories into their direct testimony. I think this is planted. Again, it's not a distortion, but it's a matter of preparation and being able to have them be ready to do that. And the goal is to get the court to develop an emotional connection to the targeted parent. One of the things that happens with those three examples, I don't know if you could sort of get a sense of what your emotional connection to that parent was that it was experiencing that. Was it one of empathy? Was it one of, you heard all these, I would assume that it was something that would be emotionally resonant to you. Expert witnesses are much less restricted by the rule. Expert witnesses can testify, rely on information that is not admitted into evidence. Hearsay, experts rely on that all the time. And what I've seen when contemplating a trial strategy that has a series of fact witnesses that describe, say, 4 or 5, whatever number of witnesses, describing particular incidents. There can be general questions, there's nothing wrong with that, but then each general answer needs to be followed by an example. And that's what I've seen seems to ring the bell. Not every time, but many of the times. Then at the end, one strategy that I've seen be effective is then have an expert witness who hasn't done an evaluation necessarily, but just an expert witness who comes in and testifies as an instructional witness or as a hypothetical witness, meaning they're asked hypothetical questions about what the court has just heard about. So the court has just heard about this kid that was taken to the therapist without his knowledge, and it was done in such a way that would bias the therapist and also actually perform alienating behaviors in the presence of the therapist. That's all in there. So be able to describe that. So a question might be, Dr. So-and-so, I'd like you to assume the following, that there's a parent takes a, and what I just basically, what might that mean? And then that becomes a platform for the expert to be able to explain it to the court. So basically, sort of wrapping it all together, making it all make sense, make it all fit together, and to create a template for, then ultimately the questions have to do, well, what's the remedy? So I think that's one very effective thing. Another that Brian had talked about, if you can get a therapist involved in the case that understands what's going on, and be very careful about that, because many will say they do and a great many of those really don't. And I've seen therapists flip, start out one way, and if you got 3 kids and a parent who are all alienated and alienating, it's basically 4 against 1. And pretty, unless the therapist is really skilled and confident in what they see because of their basis of experience, they're gonna slide. I mean, I've seen it happen. It starts out fine, and then it just starts to sour. So you have to be very careful about that. But if you do have the kind of personnel to get in that, appointed in there with the court's blessing, I think that can be more of a reasonable strategy. The other, of course, is we'll go to the court to order a custody evaluation, and as was echoed here earlier, I believe this can't be stated enough, it's very important that anybody you get involved in the case understands parental alienation and understands it really pretty, and I don't believe most do. About 5 or 6 years ago, I did continuing education seminars, or maybe it was 8, I don't know, I'm always underestimate how long, that means something, doesn't it? Probably means I'm getting older or something. But anyway, I went to, I think, 5 different cities and did this continuing education stuff with people that were forensic psychologists, and basically did a whole presentation. I was astounded. And these are people that do mostly that, if not exclusively, mostly. And the basic questions I got about it were like stunning. I mean, they really didn't get it. And unless somebody has been through that or has a loved one that's been through that, just your conventional training really doesn't cover it very well. So I think that's very important to be aware of. So if the consideration is getting a custody evaluation, read some prior evaluations they've done. Find out from other people with whom they've worked, and see if the tires, when they kick, really don't cave in. Yes. One thing I've learned is the family court system is very, very idiosyncratic. It's almost like in courtroom A, you have this one culture about how things are done. Courtroom B, sharing a wall with a different judge, will have another culture, and the rules may be very different. So you have to look at it individually. And one of the things I should have emphasized, but I didn't, is one of the most important things in deciding any of this is to know your judge. And I'll get to that, I believe, in the latter part of this. But, in civil litigation and criminal, but especially in civil litigation, jury consultants are hired all the time. That's how Dr. Phil, by the way, got involved in what he got in. He was Oprah's jury consultant during the hamburger scandal, if you remember that a bunch of years ago. But anyway, so they're hired to basically help select jury and also develop strategy according to who the audience is, in this case a jury trial. But if you think about it, a judge is a jury of 1. You don't have to evaluate 12 of them and send somebody in the parking lot to see what kind of books they're reading. They're sitting on the dashboard to figure out who they are, which is what they do sometimes. But rather you basically learn everything you can about that judge. And the best way to find out things about judges is the rumor mill around the courthouse. If you talk to enough people indirectly somehow, you'll learn things about how their preference is. I mean, there are judges who rely heavily on expert testimony. There are other judges that hate it. So naturally, you're going to put on 2 different cases depending on who your judge is. And I think that's very important to recognize. But even if you have a judge that hates expert testimony, I believe that a case can still be put on by basically telling the story with the fact witnesses. You don't have to call it parental alienation in order for the judge to get, she took the kids to a therapist and didn't tell them bad things about the dad. I mean, nobody's going to think that's good. Whether you believe that parental alienation syndrome exists or not, nobody's going to think that. And these days, I advise people not even to use the lingo. Don't even label it. Basically describe behavior, the goal being, the old psychotherapy principle, to get the judge to go, this sounds like one of those parental alienation things. Because once that light bulb goes on, you have a lot more of a chance of keeping the momentum going and breaking up the inertia that's developed around it. Okay. Final word about the practice. This I cannot emphasize enough. With the exception of the attorneys who have been here, I don't want to say anything to step on anybody's toes. In my humble estimation, of working with lots and lots of family lawyers, the practice of family law in this country is mostly substandard. The rules are not even known, the law isn't known, but even worse than that, there's very little preparation. I believe, in my view, 75–80% of how family law is practiced operates in this substandard way, but it happens so much that it now becomes acceptable. I don't know of any profession where you don't have to call people back when they call you repeatedly. But everybody nods when everybody knows that one. But when you have a good family lawyer who does what they're supposed to do, and a big part of that is preparation, you get a very different result. So that's very important. So it's finding, if you're looking for a lawyer, boy, that is the most important quality to look for, is diligence and preparation and passion. This is the kind of thing they have to become involved in on a certain level emotionally, while maintaining objectivity but having a passion about it. But there's a psychologist at Florida State University named Anders Ericsson who studies competence and excellence. One of the examples is at age 25, I think, if a competent pianist will have practiced the piano about 2,000 hours, but a competent concert pianist will have practiced the piano 10,000 hours, 5 times more. I mean, Tiger Woods is a very talented golfer, but if he didn't hit 1,000 golf balls a day, and other kind of practices as well, he wouldn't have had the success that he maybe doesn't have as much now, but you get it, you know. I mean, it's practice, practice, practice. And I have a friend who's very involved in Toastmasters, and I think they have a rule there. I could be wrong about this. They have a rule that for every time you make some address, you practice 16 times. You say it out loud to the mirror or somebody, practice, practice, practice. And what I've seen with attorneys that do this effectively, it really is, you sit there in their room at the conference table and you be pacing around, no, say it this way, let's try it again, and practice, practice, practice. So it's not just thinking on your feet. I mean, it's genuine. Again, I don't want anybody to take away the message that you sort of are making a story up, but you are putting on a play. And any kind of successful presentation involves practice. So I cannot stress that enough. One of the substandard things that I see all the time is the lack of preparation and practice. So it's not uncommon to hear, I mean, I've heard this myself, walking up the steps to the courthouse going, the preparation takes place on the steps of the courthouse going, now what's this case about? What are we doing now? And truly, I mean, and there we go, oh, well, it's this. Like that's a reasonable question to ask. So I think that's one of the ingredients of these things being successful is they are very well prepared, down to the detail, down to the strategy about what story you're telling and how to tell it. And I think that's absolutely critical. If that is not part of the formula, if it's successful, it is happenstance. You might as well flip a coin, because it's actually less than 50%, I think, because the bias of the court, the deck is essentially stacked against you. We've all seen cases, many of you lived cases, where that bias is still prevalent, and the court develops an inertia in a certain direction and gets stuck there. It's like if you think, so the idea you have to sort of, Demosthenes Arondos, how can you forget that name, right? He is a psychologist and also an attorney in Michigan, although he's all over the place too. But he talks about how we have to do in these cases, you have to break up the inertia that's been developed and get it out of that stuck place that it's in. So being able to come in and really shake up what the court's perception is something that's absolutely essential. And practicing the stories you're going to tell to the court is really what it's about. Judges, this won't take long. I got the 10-minute thing a minute ago, so I'm kind of repeating some of what I said before. Forensic psychologists and other evaluators, what a forensic psychologist in the evaluation context is supposed to do is get all the information, not there to make friends, not there to develop a therapeutic alliance, get the information and be able to report back to the court. Therapists, their role is to develop a relationship. And when you develop a relationship with someone, you develop a relationship with their bias, at least to some degree. Now, granted, a competent therapist is always going back and forth evaluating that, but nonetheless, I'm there to help you. That's a different process than the evaluator. I'm there to tell the court what I think is going on here, completely different. But when therapists are drawn into the role, and very often judges will ask therapists to do things they're not supposed to do. They'll ask them recommendations about visitation, access, and therapists are not supposed to do that because all the things necessary to have the information to do that are not done by therapists. They're just simply not. And the court is typically very fuzzy about that. So I think it's important that the court be educated about that over and over and over again to show why that is important. And I've seen judges, when they sort of get it, they kind of get it after a while, and they see the important. I was in a case in Poughkeepsie, New York, and there were three therapists that were involved in showing, painting this picture of this father who English was his second language, and he didn't come across all that well. He was very smart, but his social, personal skills weren't maybe the best. So the judge was really believing what these therapists had to say. But after be able to explain to the judge the different roles, cite the literature, show why it works this way, and so forth, you could see the judge change, and he issued a different order after that. So judges are trainable. I mean, in terms of those kinds of things. Guardians. Oh boy. Guardians are party to the case in most states. I assume so in California. Are they a party to the case? Yeah, somebody? Maybe. Anyway, in many states, in Florida, for example, when a guardian is appointed, they are a party to the case like a parent is. So it's like a third parent. And their agenda is to evaluate the best interest of the child. Then we have the issue of this is not in order, but I just can't help but say it right now. Whenever the court, like Brian said, where did this come from? Where the child gets a lawyer, that's just insane. I'd recently learned in New York, for example, when there is a law guardian appointed, which is what it's called in New York, that there was recently a rule or a statute that was passed that basically said that person can't even consider the best interest of the child. They can only represent the child's wishes, which is, can we make something more insane? I mean, they did it up there. So it's a crazy patchwork kind of thing. But anyway, guardians, we'll get to that in a second, are very often problematic in my view, but we'll get to that. Parenting coordinators, there's a wide range of what that means. That's sort of a new role that's being evolved in the family court system. Basically, they're sort of the traffic cop. That's how it started out, where they basically have a detailed parenting plan, and if there's a violation, then they blow the whistle, and sometimes have arbitration powers, sometimes don't, depending on the order. But very often, the reason this fails is that the parenting coordinators are often therapists, people with mental health backgrounds, and they get sucked into it, and they become biased. And so in theory, it makes sense, but in execution, it can sometimes be kind of problematic. Know your judge, the concept of blind justice. I had someone tell me that the closest thing we have in this country to royalty would be a family law judge. I mean, the discretion they have is enormous. Enormous. So you don't want to get a position to try to have them reversed. I mean, you want to bring them along to your perspective as quickly and as effectively as you can. And the blind justice, the blindfold on the Supreme Court is there to help minimize bias and maintain as much objectivity as possible. But when you consider that the court is also charged with determining the best interest of the child, and that's typically the case in family law. I've got to follow the law, but then I have to measure that against best interest. It creates this discretionary, wide open space that will allow judges to rule very differently. You take the same case, you can't really do this but theoretically, if you take the same case, put it on in 3 different courtrooms, you might get 3 very different outcomes. I mean, it's that because of the so the things that are not supposed to affect the case, supposed to be the facts and the law, but however, the other things that are not part of the facts, not part of the law, really do affect the outcome. And the more you can get in tune with that and be in step with that, I had a lawyer friend of mine explain many years ago, anytime you go in court, it's a fluid process. You can go in there with a plan, but one thing we know for sure, it's not going to go exactly as you thought. It's always going to be a little different, so you have to get in touch with that kind of that ebb and flow of it all. So it's a real art. I mean, I have a great respect for attorneys who were able to do this effectively. So the rules protect, however, judicial discretion allows the judge to peek through the blindfold out of the best interest. I thought that was kind of clever. The evaluators, we talked about that. I would look into their record, find out whoever other cases they've been involved in, and see if you can read any of their evaluations. Sometimes there's an evaluation, and I'm involved in a case in the Deep South, where there's an evaluator that's done pretty horrific things, and the mother, who's very industrious, found all these other evaluations where there were similar things done to these other parties. So, I mean, we now have 5 of them to show the parallel wrongdoing, and so it's always good to look into the background and look into the work product of the evaluators. Naive or polemically opposed evaluators about parental alienation can be disastrous. I mean, some evaluators, this doesn't exist. Next, or if naive, next. I mean, you want to vet those carefully, et cetera. In the event, and basically on your earlier question, what if you got somebody that is naive, and then you still, as I said before, you still want to tell the story in the way that I've described. That's what seems to, again, work. The issue of going to the court and asking for an evaluator, again, the risk-reward ratio evaluation, you can be pretty confident about an evaluator, but you don't really know, because the evaluator, if they're doing their right job, will know more about the case than you will, more than the lawyer will. So you think you know what's going on, but sometimes, it's not exactly what you think. Dealing with the evaluators. One of the things that happens, I think, when an evaluator misses something that's critical that's going on, that's a big, big problem. One final thing I'll say. In about 2001, there was a bunch of literature published that basically reformulated what we used to call it parental alienation. Now it's more often called child alienation. I think one of the things that it did was basically spread the responsibility around a little bit, and it began to interpret what was going on as being partially due to the target parent's behavior. I personally believe that's a gross distortion, but it does open. Things got a little more difficult after that stuff was published, because the idea was to get the court to see it's being set up by this one, and this one has to respond. But that really kind of confused that. But anyway, that's. I believe our time is up, and I appreciate your incredible attention. I don't think I could do this. I don't know what you guys are taking, but someone please give me some. All right. Yes, sir.
Have you ever presented this pitch to this many judges and their commissioners?
Are there judges here?
I'm just asking you.
No, I've not. I've never done this pitch before. This was,
Woefully unexperienced in all this.
well,
Being due.
well, I can't say that I terribly disagree. It's difficult to get in front of judges. One thing to do continuing legal education thing for attorneys, but judges is a little different place to go, and it's a lot more protected since I've learned. So I'm sorry to say the answer is no. If I want to extinguish negative behavior, what I need to do is focus on what that is, et cetera. Whenever anything comes up where the child says something that is like that, what you're describing, most behaviorists will say, put it on ignore. It's the same principle as years and years ago, I had somebody in my office that trained Shamu at SeaWorld. And this is a great principle too. It works with kids, dogs, killer whales. Basically, when Shamu acted badly, you know what they would do? She would turn her back on Shamu. And then to reward so the disconnect is very powerful. So I would probably say try that and see what happens and see if that helps at all. I would just respond. I would probably, again, I'm, guessing. Yeah, but I would say just pick out and sort of go through and just respond to the parts that he could find something positive, but I wouldn't address any of the negatives at all. Thank you all for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bowen. That was incredible. I know we all wish we had more time with each speaker. There's so much information, it barely satiates our appetite for the information. So thank you to all the distinguished speakers here. And I'd like to conclude the program for today. I know that we're in Long Beach, but I'm not going to give you a long speech. So many of you may not know that a great number of our speakers came to this conference to offer us their information, their wisdom, all on their dime. Bill Cable came all the way from Sydney with his wife. Brian Ludmer came from Canada. So why do these speakers do this? Why do they contribute so generously? Why does Dennis Lane do all the videotaping for us for free? Same reason you're here, because it's important. This is an important issue. We're here to protect children. So conferences like this is what ISNAF does as a service to the community, in addition to our support group meetings and resources that we offer. But the conference itself, your mission does not even cover the costs. So we would really like you to donate generously so we can continue to offer these services to the community. So our table is set up in the back, and please make your way back there and give us a donation.
Okay, so where to now? Here we are. We've had a wonderful conference. We're surrounded by alienated parents, by the professionals, by the supporters, by our experts, by people in the courts, people in healthcare, in the mental health. So what we want to share with you is where is ISNAF going, and what could you do for yourself and for the community? And if you don't stand for yourself, stand for others. As an alienated parent, my mission is no longer just to stand for my children. As I don't have my children with me, I will stand here with you and for your children, and it will be our community and our children that we will work with. So just to share briefly, because I know we all want to go get some food and a drink, where is ISNAF going? What are our immediate goals coming forth here in the next year? One is we would like to get an office space. When we receive our office space and location, we will then have access to government funding, grants, and endowments will be able to come our way. It doesn't take a huge office space, so we're fundraising to accomplish that very shortly. Another area we would like to address is bring awareness. We now have an association inside the Long Beach School District. There's 83,000 children inside this district through elementary through high school. We now have access to come in and create an educational program for all of these children and families. We are developing that, so we would ask that we get all of the professionals who are interested in at any level to participate in creating these programs, and we are moving forward in that very quickly. And finally, we're creating, and Karen's ultimate vision is a center for reunification here in Southern California, to create a home where we have experts, a place for all of us to go, a place for all of you to contribute to all of those in need. So with that, we are asking and reaching out to the community. We do have, for a donation, you can get a book, you can get CDs. Catherine McWillie has some items she's donating there. She has raffle tickets. Any way you can find, we'll ask you to reach out. And finally, we would love to have your participation. If you don't have the financial means, participate. Come to a meeting. Lead us in education. We intend to move forward in more presentations, short salons, as Karen would refer to them, and continue in our mission. And as a community, we will have a very big voice. This is one of 3 conferences that we've had, and our voice has gotten bigger. And those joining us are becoming more empowering, and we're becoming that. So with that, I will say to you, please visit the tables. Be generous and join us in our support group meetings. And if you're not an alienated parent, join us in supporting us and educating us further. And with that, thank you, and we hope to see you at the Pacifica Room. It is down the